At Thanksgiving, my parents looked at me and said, "No seat for disappointments." Then my mother quietly slid my chair away from the dinner table. 23 relatives sat frozen, pretending not to notice as if I had suddenly become invisible. The turkey was already carved. Glasses were filled. Laughter hung in the air until it didn't. I stood there holding a dish no one asked me to bring, wondering how a family could erase someone without saying a word. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope no one expected. I walked over to my father, placed it in front of him, and met his eyes for the first time that night. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said calmly. "Now I finally know why you hate me." The room went completely silent. What happened next didn't just ruin dinner, it exposed a truth my family had buried for decades. My name is Hazel Parker, and in my family, I was never the problem people talked about out loud. I was the problem they solved quietly. From the outside, our house in Maplewood, Ohio looked like something from a holiday catalog. White siding, a long dining table polished until it shined, framed family photos lining the hallway in perfect symmetry. Neighbors used to say how lucky we were, how close we seemed. They didn't notice that most of those photos didn't include me. If I was in them, I stood near the edge, half cut off, half forgotten. My younger sister Emily was always centered, smiling, winning something, being congratulated. My parents, Robert and Diane Parker, looked at her the way parents are supposed to look at their children, with pride, warmth, and expectation. When they looked at me, it was different. Not anger, not even disappointment. More like calculation. "Hazel is low maintenance," my mother liked to say to relatives. "She doesn't need much," my father added, nodding as if that were a compliment. So I learned not to need anything. I learned early how to read the room, when to speak and when to stay silent. I learned how to make myself useful. If there were dishes to wash, I washed them. If coats needed to be held, I held them. If someone needed to stay behind to clean up, I stayed. At school events, my parents sat in the front row for Emily. I stood in the back with the other parents' bags. At family gatherings, I set the table carefully, counting plates, making sure everyone else had a place. I rarely checked whether there was one for me. It wasn't that my parents were openly cruel. That would have been easier to understand. It was subtler than that, constant small signals telling me where I ranked. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Decisions made without consulting me. Praise given generously to Emily and rationed carefully when it came to me. If I brought home a good report card, my mother would say, "That's nice," and change the subject. If Emily did the same, we went out to dinner. When I asked questions, I was told I was being difficult. When I expressed hurt, I was told I was too sensitive. Over time, I stopped doing both. I convinced myself this was normal. That every family had roles and mine was simply different. I was the reliable one. The practical one. The one who didn't cause trouble. The one who could be moved without consequence. Still, there was one day each year when I let myself hope: Thanksgiving. Every November, my mother transformed the house into something sacred. The dining table became the center of everything: extended leaves, white tablecloth, carefully arranged place cards written in her precise handwriting. 20, sometimes 23 relatives gathered. Aunts, uncles, cousins, laughter, tradition. And every year, I told myself, this time will be different. Thanksgiving was about family, about gratitude, about belonging. At least, that's what my mother said. I started contributing early, bringing dishes, learning recipes, arriving before guests to help set up. I memorized where everything went in the kitchen. I knew how my mother liked the table arranged and how my father preferred his wine poured. Being useful was how I stayed included. And for a long time, it worked. Or at least, I thought it did. That Thanksgiving, as I drove to my parents' house with a dish carefully balanced on the passenger seat, I had no idea it would be the last time I tried to earn a place that was never meant for me. I didn't know yet about the envelope waiting in my bag. I didn't know that the chair I had always assumed would be there wouldn't be. And I definitely didn't know that by the end of that night, everything my family believed about me and about themselves was about to collapse. The only person in my family who ever looked at me without weighing my worth was my grandmother. Her name was Margaret Parker, and for most of my life, she was my quiet refuge. She never raised her voice, never ranked her grandchildren, She simply noticed things: who sat alone, who stayed late to clean up, who smiled too hard while being ignored. When I was a child, she used to say, "Hazel, you don't have to earn love. Anyone who makes you work for it doesn't understand it." At the time, I thought she was just being kind. Now, I know she was trying to protect me. 6 months before Thanksgiving, Grandma Margaret passed away. She died the way she lived: quietly, without drama, early in the morning while the rest of the house slept. By the time my mother called to tell me, the arrangements were already being made. "The funeral is on Tuesday," she said. "Arrive early. We'll need help." Not, "We want you there." Not, "I'm sorry." Just instructions. I arrived at the funeral home an hour early, carrying a box of printed programs my mother had asked me to pick up. The place smelled like lilies and polished wood. Soft music played somewhere in the background, meant to be comforting. My mother was already there, clipboard in hand, directing the staff. "Put those on the back table," she said without looking up, "and stand near the entrance. Greet people as they arrive." I hesitated. Shouldn't I sit with the family? She finally looked at me then, her expression perfectly neutral. "The front row is for immediate family." The words landed harder than I expected. I had spent every Sunday afternoon with my grandmother for the last 5 years. I drove her to doctor's appointments. I brought her groceries. I listened to her stories when no one else had time. Yet somehow, I wasn't considered close enough. I nodded and took my place by the door. As people arrived, they hugged my mother, praised Emily, and offered me polite smiles, the kind reserved for someone they couldn't quite place. I shook hands. I said thank you. I did what I always did. I stayed out of the way. After the service, while everyone gathered near the casket, a man I didn't recognize approached me. He wore a gray suit and carried himself with careful gentleness. "Hazel Parker?" he asked. "Yes. My name is Thomas Reed. I was your grandmother's attorney." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "She asked me to speak with you privately," he continued. "There's something she left for you." My first thought was that there had been a mistake. My grandmother hadn't left me anything of value. My parents had already discussed the will. The house would go to them. Emily would receive some jewelry. I assumed I would receive something small, sentimental. "When can I see it?" I asked. He paused. "Not yet. Your grandmother was very specific. She requested a waiting period." "A waiting period for what?" "For what's inside," he said carefully. "She wanted to give you time. Time for grief? Or time for something else? All I can tell you," he added, lowering his voice, "is that she believed you deserved the truth." The word truth echoed in my head long after he walked away. That night, after the funeral, I sat alone in my apartment staring at the ceiling. I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with my grandmother, searching for clues. There was one memory I couldn't shake. I was in my early 20s, sitting with her on the porch as the sun went down. She had taken my hand and said quietly, "Your mother carries a secret she's never faced, and until she does, she'll keep punishing the wrong person." At the time, I didn't ask what she meant. Somehow, I already knew the answer would hurt. In the weeks after her death, life went back to normal, or whatever passed for normal in my family. My parents didn't call. Emily posted pictures online, smiling, surrounded by friends. And then, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, my phone rang early in the morning. "Hazel," Thomas Reed said, "the waiting period is over. If you're ready, you can come by today." That afternoon, I sat across from him in his office as he slid a thick envelope across the desk. It was sealed with red wax. My grandmother's handwriting was on the front. "For Hazel. When you're ready." My hands trembled as I picked it up. I didn't open it. Not that day. Not that week. Instead, I placed it carefully in my bag and told myself I would wait for the right moment. I didn't realize the right moment was coming faster than I could imagine, and that it would arrive at a dinner table with one chair missing. 5 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called me. That alone should have warned me something was wrong. We didn't talk on the phone. Ever. Messages, maybe. Short ones. Functional ones. "Dinner at 6. Bring a side dish." Conversations without warmth or curiosity. But this time, my phone rang. "Hazel," she said, brisk as always. "Thanksgiving will be at our house this year. The whole family is coming." I ready ex by. "Okay," I replied. "I can arrive early," she cut in. We'll need help setting up. Of course we would. Before hanging up, she added, Emily has an announcement. Something important. There was a pause, heavy with meaning. This is not the time to make things about yourself, she said quietly. Do you understand? I understood. I always did. The night before Thanksgiving, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my bag. The envelope was inside, untouched, its edges slightly bent from where I'd checked to make sure it was still there. Part of me wanted to open it again, reread every word, confirm that it hadn't been a dream. Another part of me wanted to pretend it didn't exist, but I already knew pretending was no longer an option. Thanksgiving morning was cold and bright, the kind of crisp November day that made everything look clean and forgiving. I arrived at my parents' house an hour early, just like my mother had instructed, balancing a covered dish on my arm. The house looked perfect. A wreath hung on the front door. Candles glowed softly in the windows. From the outside, it was the image of warmth and welcome. Inside, my mother was already in command. She moved through the kitchen like a general, issuing instructions to anyone within reach. Emily stood nearby, one hand resting on her stomach, smiling serenely as relatives fussed over her. Hazel, my mother said without looking up. Put that on the counter, then start setting the table. I nodded and did as I was told. The dining table was fully extended, polished, and dressed with a white tablecloth. Place settings were already arranged: china plates, crystal glasses, neatly folded napkins, and handwritten name cards. I counted them. Once. Twice. 23 place cards. 23 seats. My name wasn't there. I told myself it had to be a mistake. My mother was meticulous, but even she made errors sometimes. I walked around the table again, slower this time, checking each card. Still nothing. Mom, I said carefully, keeping my voice low. Where's my seat? She didn't turn around. We ran out of room, she replied. You'll eat in the kitchen after. After, I repeated. Yes. After the main meal. There's no sense crowding the table. My heart began to race. There are 23 seats, I said. I only see 23 names. Emily appeared beside us, smiling brightly. The last seat is symbolic, she said. For the baby. I looked at the place card she was holding. Baby Parker, coming soon. My seat, my place, had been replaced by someone who didn't even exist yet. For a moment, I couldn't speak. You replaced me, I finally said. With a placeholder. Emily's smile flickered. Don't be dramatic, Hazel. It's just a chair. Just a chair. I felt the envelope press against my side, heavy and insistent, as if reminding me it was there. Not yet, I told myself. Not now. Give them one more chance. I followed my mother into the kitchen, closing the door behind us. Mom, I said, I need to talk to you. She continued basting the turkey, her back to me. Not now. I dropped out of college to take care of you, I said. I stayed when you asked. I gave up everything. And now you can't even give me a seat? She finally turned. You're rewriting history, she snapped. You stayed because you couldn't handle school. Don't blame me for your choices. That's not true. It is, she said coldly. Emily had a future. You had availability. The words cut deeper than I expected. Before I could respond, the kitchen door opened. My father stood there holding a glass of wine. Everything okay? He asked. My mother's voice softened instantly. Fine. Hazel was just helping. My father looked at me, then away. Go greet the guests, he said. We're about to start. I nodded. I always nodded. As I stepped back into the dining room, relatives began arriving in clusters, laughing, hugging, filling the space with noise and familiarity. I stood near the doorway, watching my family come together around a table that had no place for me. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself this wasn't the moment, but somewhere deep inside, something was shifting. The chair was gone, and for the first time in my life, I was no longer willing to stand quietly in its place. By the time everyone had arrived, the house felt smaller. 23 relatives filled the living room and dining area, their voices overlapping in a steady hum of conversation. Laughter bounced off the walls. Glasses clinked. Someone turned on soft music in the background. I stood near the kitchen doorway, half in the room, half out of it like always. My father tapped his glass with a spoon. Before we sit down, he said, smiling broadly. I just want to say how grateful I am for family. For my wonderful wife, Diane, who made all of this possible. My mother inclined her head modestly. And for our daughter Emily, he continued, raising his glass toward her, who has some very exciting news today. Applause broke out. Emily blushed, one hand resting protectively on her stomach as relatives leaned in closer. No one looked at me. Emily stood up, holding her glass carefully. Thank you all for being here, she said. As most of you know, we're expecting. More cheers, more smiles. And we've decided to name the baby Margaret, she added, beaming. After Grandma. The room erupted in approval. I felt something twist painfully in my chest. They were naming the baby after the only person who had ever truly loved me while I stood there without a chair. My mother's smile tightened for just a fraction of a second before returning to its practiced warmth. She hadn't known about the name, I could tell. But she said nothing. She never did when silence served her better. Hazel, she called out suddenly, her voice slicing cleanly through the noise. The guests are seated. Go make sure the serving dishes are ready. Not, could you help? Not when you have a moment. An order. I nodded and stepped back into the kitchen, my face burning. I could hear the scrape of chairs being pulled out, the sound of people settling into seats that weren't mine. As I carried platters from the counter, I caught fragments of conversation drifting in from the dining room. Such a shame, someone said. She never really found her footing, another replied. I heard she dropped out, a third voice added. My mother's voice floated above the rest, calm and sympathetic. I tried to help her, she said. But Hazel has always been difficult. Difficult. The word landed like a verdict. I pressed my palm against the counter, steadying myself. For years, she had been building this version of me quietly, carefully so that when people looked at me, they already knew what to think. The disappointing one. The unreliable one. The one who didn't quite belong. I took a deep breath and lifted the pie. I had brought the one recipe my grandmother had taught me herself. The crust was golden, the lattice perfect. It smelled like cinnamon and memory. I carried it into the dining room. Conversation stopped. My mother turned sharply. What is that? She asked. Grandma's pecan pie, I said. Her recipe. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. I didn't put that on the menu, she said. Take it back to the kitchen. There's room, I replied quietly. We can serve both. Her eyes flashed. We don't need it. The room was watching now. 23 pairs of eyes. She taught me how to make it, I added, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. My mother straightened, her lips thinning. You don't have a seat at this table, she said loudly. What makes you think your pie belongs here? The words sucked the air out of the room. I felt something inside me finally give way, not snap, not shatter, but release. I set the pie down gently on the table. For 32 years, I said, my voice carrying in the silence, I've tried to understand why I was never enough. If you knowed it, whiz, my father looked up sharply. Hazel, I gave up school when you asked, I continued. I stayed when you needed me. I showed up to every holiday, every gathering, every moment where I was expected to serve and disappear. My hands were shaking now, but I didn't stop. And tonight, I said, looking around the table, you couldn't even give me a chair. My mother's face hardened. You are a disappointment, she said. And there is no room at this table for disappointments. No one spoke. No one defended me. That silence was louder than any insult. I reached into my bag. The envelope brushed against my fingers. Not yet, I thought. But soon. Very soon. For a moment after my mother spoke, the room didn't react. No gasps, no protests, no one rushing to smooth things over. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles when everyone realizes something irreversible has just been said. I looked around the table at my aunts and uncles, cousins I saw once a year, people who had watched me grow up. Some stared at their plates. Some looked uncomfortable. A few looked curious, as if they were finally seeing a story unfold that had always felt slightly wrong. My father cleared his throat. Hazel, he said carefully, let's not do this here. Here. As if there had ever been a place that belonged to me. For 32 years, I said, my voice steady despite the shaking in my hands. I believed there was something wrong with me. That if I worked harder, stayed quieter, gave more, I would finally earn my place in this family. My mother scoffed. Oh please, you're being dramatic. I frank for Eunice Pless in the rain market. In the rain test. I reached into my bag. The envelope slid into my hand, heavier than paper had any right to be. This, I said, holding it up, is why. My mother's face changed. Just for a fraction of a second. Fear flashed across it before she pulled her expression back into place. What is that supposed to be? She demanded. I didn't answer her. I walked to the head of the table and placed the envelope in front of my father. Happy Thanksgiving, I said quietly. Now, I finally know why you hate me. Forks clinked. Someone inhaled sharply. My father stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Hazel, he said again, his voice lower now. Whatever this is, we can talk about it later. There is no later, I replied. There never has been. My mother stood up abruptly. This is inappropriate, she snapped. You are not going to embarrass this family. Embarrass? I almost laughed. You embarrassed me my entire life, I said. Tonight is just the first time everyone gets to see it. I turned to the room. I want to be very clear, I said. I didn't come here to hurt anyone. I came for answers. And when my parents decided I didn't deserve a seat at this table, they made the decision for me. My father finally picked up the envelope. His hands were trembling. What's inside? Emily asked, her voice thin. A DNA report, I said. And a letter from Grandma. That got their attention. My father opened the envelope slowly, pulling out the papers. His eyes moved across the page. I watched his face drain of color starting at his forehead, down to his jaw. What does it say? Someone whispered. My father swallowed. Probability of paternity, he read aloud, his voice barely audible. 0%. The room exploded. That's impossible, Emily said, standing up. That has to be fake. It's not, I replied. The lab is certified. The documentation is complete. My mother slammed her hand on the table. This is a lie, she shouted. She's making it up for attention. My aunt leaned forward. Diane, she said slowly. Is it? My mother's eyes darted around the room, searching for support. She's always been unstable, my mother said quickly. You all know that. My father didn't look up. I suspected, he said quietly. Every head turned toward him. What? Emily whispered. I suspected, he repeated. Years ago. I felt the floor drop out from under me. You knew? I asked. You knew I wasn't yours? He shook his head. I didn't know, I suspected. And I didn't want to confirm it. Why? I asked. He finally looked at me. Because if I knew for sure, he said, I would have had to do something about it. The words hit harder than any insult. So, instead, I said slowly, you did nothing. And let me take the consequences. He didn't deny it. My mother's voice broke into loud sobs. You don't understand, she cried. I was young. I made one mistake. One mistake, I repeated. That you made me pay for every day of my life. My aunt stood up. You let her believe she was the problem, she said to my mother. You denied her love to protect your secret. That's not abuse, Emily said weakly. That's just family issues. No, I said. It's emotional neglect. And it has consequences. The room went quiet again. I took a breath. I want to be clear about something else, I said. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not asking for a seat. And I am not asking to be part of this family anymore. My mother stopped crying and looked at me with pure disbelief. You can't just walk away, she said. After everything we've done for you. I can, I replied. And I am. I looked at my father one last time. You had a legal and moral obligation to protect me, I said. You chose comfort instead. His shoulders sagged. I'm sorry, he whispered. Sorry doesn't fix it, I said. But accountability might. I turned back to the table. I've consulted an attorney, I added calmly. I know my rights. And I know that neglect, even without bruises, still leaves damage. My mother went pale. You wouldn't, she said. I already have, I replied. I picked up my bag. This conversation is over. As I walked toward the door, no one stopped me. No one reached out. Behind me, the family sat frozen 23 people staring at the wreckage of a truth they could no longer ignore. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in. And for the first time in my life, I stepped away from a table that never belonged to me without apologizing. I didn't drive home that night. I drove until the houses thinned out and the streetlights disappeared, until the road turned dark and quiet enough for my thoughts to finally catch up with me. I pulled into an empty parking lot and turned off the engine, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. For 32 years, I had been afraid of losing my family. Now that it had happened, what I felt wasn't fear. It was relief. My phone buzzed nonstop while I sat there. Missed calls, messages, notifications piling on top of each other like they always had, except this time, I didn't feel obligated to answer. I didn't owe anyone my silence anymore. The first message I read was from my Aunt Linda. "You were brave. I'm so sorry we didn't see it sooner." The next was from a cousin who had barely spoken to me growing up. "I had no idea. None of us did. You didn't deserve that." Then came the calls I expected. My mother, my father, Emily. I ignored them all. The following morning, I met with Daniel Brooks, the attorney I had spoken to weeks earlier, the one my grandmother had quietly recommended in her letter. "This kind of harm is often invisible," he told me gently as we sat across from each other in his office. "But that doesn't mean it isn't real. Emotional neglect, coercion, long-term deprivation of opportunity. These things leave a paper trail if you know where to look." He didn't promise revenge. He promised clarity. We reviewed documents together, medical records, financial decisions, emails, patterns that showed how responsibility had been placed on me and removed from others, how my future had been quietly redirected without my consent. "You have options," he said. "And more importantly, you have the right to choose what comes next." That mattered more than anything. Within a week, the fallout reached the rest of the family. My father moved out of the house, quietly, without arguments or announcements. I heard from my aunt that he had hired his own lawyer. My mother, on the other hand, tried to regain control the only way she knew how, by rewriting the story. "She's confused. She's exaggerating. She's being manipulated." But this time, the story didn't stick. Too many people had been in the room. Too many had seen the documents. Too many had heard my father admit what he knew and chose not to know. Silence was no longer on her side. Emily called me late one night. "Hazel," she said, her voice trembling, "everything is falling apart." I almost laughed at the phrasing. "Falling apart for whom?" "For Mom," she continued. "For Dad. For all of us." "What about me?" I asked quietly. She hesitated. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I swear I didn't." "I believe you," I replied. "But you benefited from it." The line went quiet. "I don't know who I am if all of this is true," she whispered. "That's not my problem to solve," I said, not unkindly. I had to figure out who I was without any help at all. When I hung up, I didn't feel guilty. That surprised me. In the weeks that followed, I made decisions I had never allowed myself to make before. I enrolled in evening classes at the local college to finish the degree I had abandoned. Sitting in a classroom again felt strange at first, like stepping into a life I had once imagined but never believed I was allowed to have. I updated my resume. I applied for jobs I had convinced myself I wasn't qualified for. And slowly, quietly, doors began to open. One afternoon, my father left a voicemail. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice rough. "I just want you to know I'm taking responsibility. I should have protected you. I didn't. And I live with that." I listened to it twice. Then I deleted it. Not out of anger, but because closure didn't require a response. What surprised me most wasn't the loss of my family. It was the space that loss created. Without constant judgment, without being measured and minimized, I started to hear my own thoughts more clearly. I began to understand how much of my identity had been shaped by survival rather than choice. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. And that made all the difference. Change didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly, in small decisions I used to be afraid to make. I moved out of my apartment and into a smaller place closer to campus, a studio above a bakery that smelled like warm bread every morning. It wasn't impressive, but it was mine. No one questioned why I deserved it. No one reminded me of what I owed. For the first time, I woke up without bracing myself. Going back to school was harder than I expected. I sat in the back row at first, listening more than speaking, old habits clinging to me. My classmates were younger, confident, unapologetic. But no one treated me like I was out of place. That alone felt revolutionary. At work, something shifted too. My manager pulled me aside one afternoon. "You know," she said, "I always thought you didn't want more responsibility." "I did," I replied honestly. "I just didn't think I was allowed to ask." She smiled. "Ask next time." So I did. And doors opened. Not because someone felt sorry for me, but because I had always been capable. I just hadn't been seen. My family, meanwhile, continued to unravel without me. My father finalized the separation. My mother stopped calling once it became clear I wouldn't play my role anymore. Emily sent messages occasionally, careful ones, filled with uncertainty. I didn't block her, but I didn't chase her either. Boundaries, I was learning, weren't punishments. They were protection. One evening, I received an email from Daniel Brooks, my attorney. "There's one more thing your grandmother left," he wrote. "She asked me to hold on to it until you were ready." We met the following week. He slid a folded document across the table. It wasn't legal paperwork. It was a name, an address, and a note in my grandmother's handwriting. "I didn't want you to search alone." My heart pounded as I read it. The name belonged to a man who lived less than an hour away. According to the preliminary research my grandmother had commissioned, he matched the timeline, the location, the details she had pieced together quietly over years. My biological father. I stared at the paper for a long time. For most of my life, I had wanted answers so badly I thought they would save me. Now that the possibility was real, I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. "What if he doesn't want to know me?" I asked Daniel. "Then you'll still know who you are," he replied. "And that matters." I didn't contact the man right away. Instead, I went home and cooked dinner for myself. I set the table 2 plates, even though I was alone. I sat down and ate slowly, something I had never done before. I realized then how much of my life had been about waiting. Waiting to be chosen. Waiting to be invited. Waiting to be allowed. I wasn't waiting anymore. Weeks passed. I celebrated my 33rd birthday quietly with friends from class and coworkers who knew me only as Hazel, not as the family disappointment, not as the one who stayed behind. They brought cupcakes. They laughed. They asked me what I wanted next. No one asked what I owed. One night, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. The voicemail came seconds later. "Hello, Hazel," a man's voice said, hesitant and careful. "I don't know if this is welcome. I recently learned something about your grandmother, and about you." I listened to it twice. Then I set my phone down and went to the window. I wasn't afraid. I just wasn't ready. And for the first time in my life, not being ready didn't feel like failure. It felt like choice. Tonight, I'm sitting at my own table. It isn't large. It doesn't match. The chairs aren't perfectly aligned. But every single one of them belongs here because I chose them. I think about that Thanksgiving table sometimes. About the chair that was taken from me so deliberately, as if removing it would erase my existence. For years, I believed that was true. That if my family decided I didn't belong, then maybe I really didn't. I know better now. Belonging isn't something other people get to vote on. A few days after the voicemail, I finally listened to it again, really listened. The man's voice wasn't demanding. It wasn't entitled. It sounded unsure. Human. I didn't call him back right away. Instead, I opened my grandmother's letter one more time. The paper was worn soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. There was one line I kept coming back to. "You were never the problem. You were the reminder." That was the truth my family couldn't face. I wasn't punished because I failed. I was punished because I existed. Understanding that didn't erase the pain, but it freed me from carrying shame that was never mine. A week later, I sent a short message. "Hello. I received your voicemail. I'm not ready to meet yet, but I wanted you to know I heard you." That was enough. I didn't owe anyone instant forgiveness. I didn't owe anyone closure on their timeline. Healing, I was learning, wasn't about rushing toward answers. It was about finally giving myself patience. My mother hasn't called again. My father sends occasional updates through my Aunt Neutral, careful messages about logistics and responsibility. I don't respond, but I don't feel anger when I read them. Indifference, it turns out, is a kind of peace. Emily sent me a message last week. "I'm in therapy," she wrote. "I don't know if that fixes anything, but I wanted you to know I'm trying." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I hope you find what you're looking for, I typed back. It was the truth. And it was enough. As for me, I'm finishing my degree one class at a time. I'm working a job where my effort is noticed, not exploited. I've learned how to say no without apologizing and yes without explaining myself. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel the echo of that moment, the scrape of the chair being pulled away, the sound of my mother's voice calling me a disappointment. But now, when that memory surfaces, it no longer defines me. It reminds me how far I've come. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's this. You don't owe loyalty to people who hurt you. You don't owe silence to protect someone else's lies. And you don't need permission to take up space. Family isn't about who sits at the table. It's about who refuses to make you stand. Wherever you are, whatever you're going through, if you've ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, I hope you remember this. You are not a disappointment. You are not replaceable. And no one gets to remove your seat without your consent. I finally chose myself, and that changed everything.